What up, what up, what up? It's your man Sean P coming in live. This is a special Sean P experience, man. We here on the Sitting with the Griots podcast, man. This has been a very long anticipated show. This has been months in the
Absolutely.
making, and I finally got my brother on the show to talk about his amazing book about Hubert Harrison, man. You gotta get this work. You gotta get this work. We'll try to break it down as much as we can in one episode. This is a lot to cover, so we're gonna touch what we can touch, right? So how you doing this afternoon, my man? How you doing?
I'm doing so well. Thank you so much, Sean, for having me. As I said, I'm in Atlanta at the moment for the Asala Black History Conference, and yeah, I'm really excited to be on this podcast because, as you said, it's been months in the making. So it's great to be here finally.
Yes, sir, man. I'm gonna do your introduction proper, right? So today we are joined by Dr. Brian Kwoba, Associate Professor of History and Director of African and African American Studies Program at the University of Memphis. Intellectual historian and activist. Dr. Kwoba's scholarship dives deep into Black radicalism, political thought, and the powerful social justice movements led by people of African descent. His groundbreaking work on Hubert Harrison shines light on one of the most important yet often looked figures of the Harlem Renaissance and Black radical traditions. Welcome to the show, my brother.
Thank you so much, Sean. Thank you for having me.
So this show is called Sitting with the Griots. And there's a chapter in your book you cover what you call griotversity, the grioversity, right? You
Yeah.
called it in the book. So,
Yes.
so I love asking my guests this question: how do you feel about taking on the role of the current modern day griot? And whenever you think about that role, do you feel any kind of like weight or responsibility carrying that title?
On some level, yeah. I mean, the griot is a West African figure who's seen as a storyteller, poet, wisdom keeper, historian, so on and so forth, musician, oftentimes, poet, whatever. And it is a responsibility because you are interacting with the community, you're holding some wisdom and some knowledge and some history, some stories from the community. But I think also it's a role that comes naturally, right? People, kind of do what they need to do as the spirit moves them to do so, and that's kind of how I found myself in this role, relating with Hubert Harrison and telling his story as a griot. Also helps me to kind of step into my own story in a better way, in a deeper way, and understand myself, more clearly in some ways. Mm-hmm.
So, in the purpose of the book, you mentioned this interesting fact about yourself. You wasn't always crazy about history. You didn't always like history. So, we live in a time right now with the school systems where they're abandoning books, they're trying to censor curriculum and things of that nature. What can
Uh-huh.
we do? What can we do to spark that interest in the history early for the youth? How can we combat that?
That's a great question. And you're right. I never liked history. I didn't like it in middle school, didn't like it in high school. In fact, I never even took a single history course as an undergrad. It wasn't until I became an activist, started at that time trying to stop the Iraq War, that I've started to realize why history matters, because it explains how we got the world we have, right? And if you want to change anything, it's useful to know how it got to be the way it is. So, what I think we have to do in this period where our history is under attack, our museums are under attack, I think we have to do for self, right? We have to create spaces, alternative spaces and places where we can actually do the work. Because if it's not going to get the capacity that it has had within institutions, it's still going to have to happen, right? It's going to have to happen somewhere. And so, if we need to do that work in our spare time, in our free time, Saturday school, whatever it's going to take, I think we have to be creative, right? They're very creative in how they're attacking us, and so we got to be creative in how we defend and move and maneuver, amidst the difficulties, amidst the uphill battle. I mean, at my university, for example, they just eliminated the Office of Multicultural Affairs right before the semester started. And unfortunately, I think they may go further and eliminate, Black studies, women and gender studies, international and global studies, and they may actually come for our curriculum, like actual faculty who are teaching African American history, like me. And because I'm based in the state of Tennessee, which is a very red state, very right wing state legislature that is in lockstep with the Trump administration. And so, I think a lot of us are facing a lot of headwind, and but that doesn't mean we stop doing what we do, right? It means we just got to figure out how to do it a different way.
So I planned on asking this question toward the bottom of the show, but it came up just now, so let's do it. When it comes to Black studies, I love Black studies personally, and I love to ask my Black studies scholars on this show, man, for anybody out there watching, like, why do you think Black studies still matter? Why is Black studies still important in today's time?
I mean, it's critical in today's time because it actually illuminates the world we have in ways that really no other field can do. I mean, one simple example that I'm always teaching with my students is the wonderful book by Ivan Van Sertima called "They Came Before Columbus," which is about the African presence in the Americas before Columbus. And he marshals such a wide range of evidence, botanical evidence, theological evidence, archaeological evidence, navigational evidence, all these different things to show an extensive centuries-long presence of African people in the Americas, North, Central, South, and the Caribbean, long before Columbus. I mean, that just helps to liberate our minds, to understand that African people have been a global people, for a very long time, and did not come to the Americas initially as enslaved people, but as masters of their own destiny. This is something you would not get any other way but through Black studies. And this is empowering this type of work, when we're talking about Black studies. It's empowering not just for people of African descent, but it's also, I think, really valuable, important, and humbling to non-Black people, because oftentimes, whether they realize it or not, they are reared on an anti-Black subconscious attitude and worldview that prevents them from understanding, for example, the simple fact that Africans have been in the Americas for a long time before Columbus ever came here. And so that's just one example. But I think, if we extrapolate that out to the larger study and field and discipline of Black studies, there's just so many other examples of how you really won't understand the world without it, right? I mean, Black history is world history, right? And the future is African. And therefore, if you want to get on the right side of history, you gotta look at this at the extraordinary body of work that has been done and is being done and will continue to be done into the future, no matter what happens in Washington.
So, in conducting my research for the show, you've been blessed to be on various platforms and book talks, and you're on panels and everything. What is something about this book you have not been able to elaborate on just yet, the way you probably wanted to? Because it is a lot to cover. So, like, I'm sure every host trying to find a way to condense it. What's something that you want to elaborate on?
Well, thank you for that question. Let me ask you a question first, though, if I may. And I will answer your question. I just want to ask you a question first, just to get this out of the way. I want to know sort of how do you feel about the book? I mean, specifically, would you recommend this book to other people? And if so, why?
Okay. Here we go. A little Sean P. promo. I absolutely love this book. For months, I've been telling all of my friends about this book. I'm 43 years old. I'm just giving my age, but like a lot of my peer group, we're crazy about Malcolm X. We're crazy about Marcus Garvey. We're crazy about some of these leaders, but we're not as privy to like who sparked their mind. Right. In football, they talk about the coaching tree in football, it's about the coaches and who they coached up under. We didn't see who were these leaders up under, what feet they sat at to get their spark. You do a good job in this book. In a particular chapter, you give a whole trajectory to Rustin and A. Philip Randolph and then MLK and then so and so. I mean, just an example of it had me on fire about that. I've been trying to tell all of my friends I can, like, bro, you gotta get this book. And I want to say this too. There are other books about him out there, with all respect. I want those books, but they're like 700 pages, 800 pages, or whatever. Your book being at this size, and the writing is still readable, it's not above anybody's head. Some PhDs is like they're
Mm.
writing to their PhD friends, not really
Yep.
a lay
Yep.
person, but this is
Right.
still accessible. Anybody can read it, understand it, and extrapolate what they need. And
Mm.
I plan on doing some more things with the end notes. I plan on going further in my personal studies. So that's kind of
Mm.
how I feel about the book.
Thank you so
Uh,
much. Yeah,
I love it.
thank you, man. I appreciate that. It's great to hear that because I really did try to write it for a general audience.
Yeah, yeah,
Not just for
yeah.
scholars or even primarily for scholars, but actually for the people, because that's what Harrison was about. He was a man of the people. He was speaking on street corners to masses of people large enough to block traffic. And I felt like if I wanted to do right by Harrison, I had to embody that spirit of trying to reach the people, right? Reach people who don't have the fancy degrees and what have you, but need this information, right? And deserve this information. I mean, this is one of our titans of the Black radical tradition, who has just been so scandalously marginalized and sort of excluded from all of the major fields of history and stories from the past that he should be more central in. So one of the things that you asked me something that I haven't been able to speak about, as much doing all these podcasts and all these things. I mean, there's a couple of things. I mean, first of all, I have to say, for those who haven't read the book is very wide ranging. It covers everything from sex and love and religion to science and technology to imperialism, socialism. I mean, there's a whole lot of stuff in this book. And so I never quite get to all of it in any one conversation. But one of the things that I haven't been able to talk as much about is the Russian Revolution. The Russian Revolution is one of the sort of themes of the book, or one of the things that I'm in dialogue with, because in the United States we have been fed for many decades a sort of Cold War propaganda line that is sort of Russophobic, right? We're supposed to despise anything Russian. We're supposed to, be skeptical about Moscow and anything that comes out of the Russian-speaking world because of the Cold War history and the anti-communist religion of the United States, which is so dogmatic and so one-sided. Meanwhile, Hubert Harrison lived through the era where the Russian Revolution emerged, right? Where the Russian people rose up and overthrew not just the Tsar, who had ruled them, this dynastic monarchy that had ruled them for centuries, but they also ended up in the October Revolution, 1917. They formed all these Soviets, which were these radical democratic organizations in workplaces, in the barracks, and in the countryside among peasants. These democratic councils of elected delegates that were very grassroots, very bottom up. And in the All-Russian Congress of Soviets, this sort of national federation of Soviets with delegates representing people all over the country, they actually voted the Bolshevik Party, Lenin and Trotsky's party, into a majority, and they were able to actually take power and expropriate the landowners, expropriate the capitalist class, and make basically a working class revolution that swept away all the sort of old muck of ages, the monarchs, the capitalists, the landowners, right? All the sort of exploiting forces in the country. And this was inspiring to Black radicals in the United States, particularly in Harlem, where, Harrison and others were, building a sort of Black presence within the Socialist Party. The first generation of Black communists emerges out of this same historical period. Harrison's Liberty League, right, which is this critical organization that, among other things, recruits a young Marcus Garvey and imbues him with a whole number of strategy and tactics with which he uses to build the UNIA into this massive transnational Black organization. And I think because of the sort of default Russophobia and anti-communism in the United States, we are cut off from a whole revolutionary politic that the Russian Revolution represents. People like Lenin and Trotsky and Alexandra Kollontai, who I speak about in the book. I mean, there's just some extraordinary political thinking that went on in that context, and that, as I said, Black radicals were inspired by, were learning from, were looking to emulate in various different ways because of how that revolution dealt such a massive blow to some of these systems of oppression. For example, anti-Jewish racism was very prominent in the Russian Empire under the Tsars. You had pogroms against Jews in Ukraine, in Poland, in Belarus, in the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and of course in Russia itself. A long history of anti-Jewish racism, prejudice, massacres. The Russian Revolution elected Leon Trotsky, a Ukrainian-born Russian Jew, to the head of the Petrograd Soviet, which was basically the nerve center of the revolution. And Trotsky, of course, becomes commander of the Red Army in the Russian Civil War. And the Red Army was victorious and defeated the White Army of counter-revolutionaries. And this is an army whose top commander is Jewish in a land that had been plagued by anti-Jewish racism. So it just shows you sort of how transformative that experience was. And I think it really set off a whole shockwave around the world. In Europe, there were uprisings and revolutions in Germany, in Austria, all over Europe. And then, of course, in the United States, we had the Green Corn Rebellion, for example, but also the Seattle General Strike, which I love the fact that I was able to squeeze that into the book, because a lot of people don't realize that in 1919, the working class of Seattle rose up and took over the city and ran it in their own interest for a time, in ways that opened the door to what a working class revolution could actually look like in the United States. And that's exactly why it's never taught in high schools and it's banned from the K through 12 curriculum. They don't want people to know that there's ever been a general strike in the United States, let alone that there's some lessons that we could learn from that, given that we're living under a new version of the robber barons of the Gilded Age, right? What we call now the billionaire oligarchs, who Harrison, was struggling against his own version of that in his day, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the J.P. Morgans, right? And so there's a lot of lessons to learn from this history, revolutionary history, working class politics. There's kind of some Marxist theory in the book. And of course, it's unapologetically Black. And so I think this one is for us and by us in that sense, or at least that's how I intended it.
Now, what you say about that international piece is important. I'm thinking about most of our leaders were always very global minded. Stokely Carmichael, of course, Malcolm X, Huey P. Newton, the Black Panther Party, but they were always looking across at these other ideas to find a different way to go about doing this whole thing, man. So I think we see a tree, once again, a tree of us looking abroad for an answer to the American problem.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and it's part of it is necessity, right? In the sense that as 12% minority in this country, we're not actually going to be able to get free by ourselves. We're going to need allies if we want to overturn this system. But it's also, there's a lot to learn from struggles in other countries, right? There's a lot to learn from struggles, not just in Asia or in Europe, but in Africa as well, and in the Caribbean, right? I mean, the Haitian Revolution is one of the most important revolutions in world history, especially if we're talking about Black people and Black liberation, And so that's another thing I really tried to bring into the book is a global perspective on what's happening in Harlem and what's happening for Hubert Harrison and his generation of Black radicals there.
Now, this is important to me. And for those that probably see in the book, like passing by, might not realize the importance of this. But this book is a part of the John Hope Franklin series in African American history and culture. What does it mean to you to be a part of the long-standing tradition of the John Hope Franklin series?
Yeah, I mean, John Hope Franklin is one of the sort of pioneering historians of African American history. He's somebody who I'm honored to have my name associated with because he really laid a foundation for a lot of the subsequent historical scholarship that came after him, and I'm in that sense I'm standing on his shoulders. I definitely am grateful to be a part of this series and to be on this press, UNC Press more generally, You may know UNC Press is one of the top presses in African American history, and so part of why I wanted to publish with UNC is I knew that it would, more people would be able to see the book if I could get a contract with UNC, and so thankfully, luckily, I managed to do that, and yeah, I'm really excited to be on this series and with this press, and yeah, it's great to see the reaction. People are really taking to the book well.
And once again, for another show and peace stamp. For years now, I have a long-standing relationship with University of UNC Press, man, and they always do me right. They always have amazing staff, do legit business, always on the up and up. So thank you, shout out for even getting me this book. Shout out to the press, right? So
Absolutely.
I love to hear about the research process. I'm really a process-driven person. When a
Mm.
text covered a person this big, what was that process like researching him? And then more importantly, how do you decide what could not make it into the book? Because I'm more than sure they got stuff you couldn't
Mm.
fit in. It'd be 1,000 pages, right? So what was that like?
Yeah. That's a great question. So the research process, I mean, this is another reason why I'm so excited to share this work, is that, I started this project as a PhD dissertation in 2013 at the University of Oxford in the UK. And I knew that I wanted to study Harrison. I knew I wanted to do a PhD on Harrison. And so I basically, started out just reading what I could about him. And eventually I got to Columbia University, which is where there's a collection of Harrison's papers, the Hubert Harrison papers. Harrison's diaries are there, his scrapbooks, letters of correspondence with various other of his contemporaries, and a lot of his writings, many of which are unpublished. And that was really the first chance where I really got to kind of sink my teeth in at an archival level with primary source documents in the Harrison archive. Of course, I should back up a little bit and say that, Jeff Perry is someone who I'm certainly in debt to, in the sense that he's sort of the first scholar to write book-length treatments of Harrison. He's written a 2-volume biography of Harrison, which is meticulous and detailed like a reference work, something that I really learned a lot from. That said, at nearly 1,200 pages, not including footnotes between the 2 volumes, that's a bit daunting for the general reader. And so I tried to write a book that would be, punchy, thematic, right? A single volume treatment that gets you the most important sort of things you need to know about Harrison and why he's so significant, right? Why he matters to the Black radical tradition, and how influential he was, right? And how much of an impact he had, despite the fact that many people have never heard about him nowadays. And so the research process, Perry was my initial kind of inspiration, because I got Perry's book and I read it and I was like, wow, Harrison is a fascinating figure, and why have I never heard of him before? So that set me down the path, of doing the PhD, eventually getting to the Harrison papers in Columbia. And then a few years later, fast forward, I wrote my dissertation. I had Robin D.G. Kelly as one of my external examiners, which was a really beautiful experience. And, I'm so grateful for Robin's endorsement with the book. And a couple of years later, I ended up doing a Schomburg a residency at the Schomburg Center in New York, which allowed me to do more research and write the chapter that I didn't have in my dissertation, which is chapter 6, entitled Black Free Love Politics and the Queer New Negro. That was a really challenging chapter to write in a lot of ways, because, we don't have a lot of historical scholarship on Black free lovers, right? Black folks who rejected compulsory monogamy and sought erotic liberation. Angela Davis has written a book on the blues women, who were some of the most, erotically liberated people of the 1920s and 30s. But apart from that, there was very little scholarship, very little work done on this dimension of our experience. And so I was grateful for the Schomburg Fellowship, because it allowed me to do all this research and write a chapter that I think really breaks some new ground. Not in the sense that it's never been done before. Obviously, I'm describing things that were done in the 1910s and 20s and 30s, but breaks new ground in the sense that a lot of us have forgotten about that entire tradition, that entire history of the kind of erotic liberation politics that emerge in the so-called Harlem Renaissance context, where people are experimenting not just with art and culture, but with sexuality as well. And I think, here's where I lean on Jennifer Nash's point that, like, if we're serious about Black liberation, can we really imagine Black political liberation without Black sexual liberation? Or is it like Fannie Lou Hamer and Ella Baker said, no one's going to get free unless we all get free?
I got a wonderful question from the chat. One of my scholars in here, my brother, he said, during the research process, we might not like what we find. What didn't resonate with you about Harrison?
That's a great question. And it relates to perhaps what didn't make it into the book. So I'll give an example. One of the things that was difficult to research was his relationship with his wife. He had a very strained relationship with his wife, Lynn. I mean, he loved her to his dying day, and they never divorced. Despite all the trials and tribulations they went through, but their relationship did reach a breaking point around 1914, because Harrison, on the one hand, he was married with children, and on the other hand, he was a free lover, and he was engaging in extramarital romances outside of the home. His wife was more traditional, more conservative, more Christian oriented. And so naturally this created a lot of tension, right? And eventually it reached a breaking point, and Harrison ends up moving out. They were still co-parenting the children, but they were no longer cohabiting after that moment. And they even had another child some years later. So it's clear that the love never died. They still loved each other. And I try to emphasize that in the book. But yeah, it was difficult to read some of that, because it's almost like you feel for the whole family, right? Not just for Hubert, but also for his wife, Lynn. Irene was her official name. And then the children as well, right? I mean, I'm a child of divorce. My parents split when I was very young, and I know I ended up with some scars from my dad not being around. And so just imagining, that experience for Harrison's children, it's like these are some of the more sticky and tricky aspects of doing history. And then it's like, how much of this do you share with folks, right? Because this is very intimate, very sensitive, and very personal matters. And so this is, to answer your question, a lot of this didn't get into the book because I was like, you know what? I don't know if I feel comfortable sharing some of these extremely intimate, sensitive, and personal details about someone who, I'm trying to lift up and show his contributions to the struggle. I don't think I shy away from criticizing Harrison when and where it's warranted, because I don't think anybody should be put on a pedestal, right? We all have our spots and our wrinkles, including some of the people that we lionize or that we see as heroes and inspirations. And so I talk about Harrison's terrible management of his finances, for example, right? I talk about the fact that he had some contradictory gender politics, right? On the one hand, he was supporting a Black woman's right to vote. He was working with Black women suffragettes. He was very, very much ahead of his time in terms of critiquing compulsory monogamy and giving lectures on women's sexual health and reproductive rights. On the other hand, he makes a very kind of homophobic comment about lesbian women, Virgin Islander women, even though he had, queer male friends like Langston Hughes and Claude McKay and Richard Bruce Nugent. So I think there was some contradictory gender politics, right? He writes a whole book, When Africa Awakes. It only has one article out of the 50 essays that are in the book. There's only one that's about women. And it's not about the political agency or leadership of women. It's not about their intellectual dynamism. It's about their beauty. It's about how beautiful Black women are. And it's like, okay, yeah, that's true. But, given that he had worked with women in the club movement, people like Frances Reynolds Keyser at the White Rose Home for Colored Girls, given that he'd worked with Irene Mormon Blackstone, who was a Black business owner and Garvey movement figure in New York, given that he was building on the legacy of women like Ida B. Wells and the anti-lynching movement that Wells helped to spearhead and initiate. Not to mention Grace P. Campbell, one of the pioneering Black women in the socialist and later communist parties. Williana Burroughs, another pioneering Black woman communist. And then, of course, white radical women, too. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, who he shared a stage with in the support of the Patterson Silk Strike in 1913. Emma Goldman is another radical anarchist white woman who Harrison, was inspired by in some ways. Harrison is working with all these different race women, socialist, communist women, anarchist women. You would think that he might have written something a little more balanced about women in terms of his writings, but we don't see that. So again, that's why I don't think he was some type of unreconstructed sexist. I think he just was contradictory. There were contradictions in his politics. He could support radical women on the one hand and also have nothing to say about or fail to mention their unique intellectual and political contributions on the other.
And that's always an interesting topic, because when you're choosing what to say and what not to say, it's like whenever Jonathan Ives' book came out almost 2 years ago, King, the Pulitzer Prize book, King, right? And my friends and I debated a lot, like some of the things he put out about their marriage and about their stuff. I mean, a lot of it's common knowledge at this point, but there's some other things we might have known. Like, was it really worth putting that in the book, or does it really humanize it? Like, for some people, but then to be more human, it makes them more risen up. Like, okay, he's not a demigod. He's a regular man with regular things going on, trying to do an amazing thing. He's a guy. He's a regular guy, right? And then the other side is, does it diminish? Does it tarnish the legacy? So
right.
There's always that dichotomy of, I don't know how you do that,
Yeah, well, here's a very interesting response to that question. One that I would venture to guess most people have never heard before, which is that one of the things I argue for in chapter 6, the one I mentioned, Black Free Love Politics, which Harrison argued, is that we are not monogamists by nature. And if you read a book like, for example, Sex at Dawn, it becomes abundantly clear with overwhelming historical, archaeological, sociological evidence that we're not monogamists by nature, but by compulsion from society. From the church plays a huge role, the government plays a huge role, right? And just the fact of the nuclear family in this so-called Western civilization and private property, right? The ruling class wants to know who to pass down their property to. Donald Trump wants to know that it's Baron Trump, right? Because Donald Trump can and probably has had a range of different, sexual experiences, many of which are probably deeply problematic on the island with Epstein and so on. But he wants to know who to pass down his wealth to. And so that private property of the ruling class produced a nuclear family ideology, a privatized family, even though indigenous cultures never had a privatized conception that way, which is why you find things like polygamy in so many indigenous cultures in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, elsewhere. And so here's the thing. Here's the real kicker, right? If you can allow, even just for the sake of argument, without researching deeply into it, if you can allow me that we're not monogamists by nature, then we're able to reread figures like Dr. King and Malcolm X and W.E.B. Du Bois and Paul Robeson and Amy Ashwood Garvey and Alain Locke and the blues women, right? Not as deviants, not as sexual deviants for refusing to confine their sexual or romantic lives to just one person exclusively, but as folks who are doing what is natural to all of us, and then it forces us to check our assumptions, right? Our often Christian commitment to this notion of compulsory monogamy. And that's why I use that phrase in the book, right? The problem is not monogamy. which is just one of many configurations that people can choose to enter into in their sexual or romantic life. The problem is compulsory monogamy, right? Making that thing compulsory for everybody in a kind of one size fits all fashion, whether or not that feels natural to everybody, whether or not that is natural for everybody, and whether or not it's actually, a creation of a sort of capitalist, colonialist, Christian, white supremacist culture that serves particular ends, and reproduces all these other systems in accordance with those ends.
Thank you for that. I think we just organically landed on this spot. It's by habitat. So my next question was, my friends and I are trying to clearly define what does it mean to be radical, right? So we see in social media these days, they take and they muddy up certain words on purpose. And so you might see somebody, they're a radical and this guy's radical, and it's always like a negative connotation onto it almost. So could you define the Black radical tradition for us, and what is that really saying?
Absolutely. So one thing I often tell my students is, when you think radical, think of a radish, because they share the same etymological root, and radish is a root vegetable, right? Radical, in other words, is about going to the root of the problem. Let me just share a quote from the book. This is right from page 2 of the introduction, Ella Baker's definition of what it means to be radical. She says, quote, "In order for us as poor and oppressed people to become part of a society that is meaningful, the system under which we now exist has to be radically changed. This means we're going to have to learn to think in radical terms. I use the term radical in its original meaning, getting down to and understanding the root cause. It means facing a system that does not lend itself to your needs and devising means by which you change that system," unquote. So if we think about being radical as getting to the root of the problems, the root of the injustices, the root of the systems of oppression that afflict us, as opposed to, what the society and the ruling class wants to think radical. Well, they want us to think it means you're an extremist, or you're a terrorist, or you're irrational in your beliefs, right? They've deliberately imbued the word radical with a negative connotation to scare people off it, right? And to dissuade people from thinking in radical terms, or even understanding that the original meaning of radical means getting to the root of the problem. So when we're talking about Black radical tradition, we're talking about Black folks who want to get to the root of racial violence and racial oppression, and all the other oppressions that that's connected to, like capitalism, like imperialism and colonization, right? Like some of the toxic forms of patriarchy and gender oppression and sexual repression, right? That are necessary to build up this so-called Western civilization that we're living under. And there's a tradition of folks who have done that. I think of Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman in the 19th century. Ida B. Wells, right? Getting to the root of lynching. She was so incisive about the way in which lynching was a tool by which, Black folks were basically kept in their place, right? We have the Black socialist and communist, or Black Marxist tradition, we might say, broadly speaking, which is looking at capitalism and, the relationship between racial oppression and capitalism, and the interlinkages there, the intertwinedness of that. There's the anti-imperialist tradition, right, of Black folks. And then there's, of course, the Black nationalist or Black internationalist radicalisms that are about linking up the struggles of Black folks all over the world, right? People of African descent throughout the diaspora and on the continent, as a way to interrupt the ways in which, anti-Black oppression is also a global system of its own, in and to itself, that is connected to some of these other systems, right? So when I say Black radical tradition, or when we're talking about Black history or Black politics in radical terms, it means getting down to the root cause and tearing that system out by its roots, rather than just clipping the leaves, right? Or dealing with the kind of symptoms or surface level issues, like racial microaggressions, for example. Like, I don't like when I'm in the workplace and I meet somebody new and they're like, oh, are you a substitute teacher? I remember I used to teach high school, and there was someone new, and then I introduced myself in the hallway, and it's like, oh yeah, I'm so and so. She's like, oh, are you a substitute? And it's like, why would you assume, like, no, I'm not a substitute. I'm a full-time, fully fledged teacher in this high school. Why would you assume? So yeah, I don't like racial microaggressions, but there are systems that are much more deeply rooted that produce that symptom, right? There's a disease that is producing that symptom. And the point about being radical is getting to the root of that disease rather than just dancing around the surface level symptoms that is never going to actually solve fundamentally, the structures and sort of processes that are producing these symptoms.
Now, I want to talk about Harrison's his street style of teaching, right? One of my favorite parts of the book, because about 2010, give or take, is whenever I started coming into all of this at a high level. And that street style of speaking is where I got a lot of my start from, personally, right? So Harrison out there in Harlem on a step ladder, covering a wide range of topics, and he's speaking out in the open, like a university, if you will, for anybody walking by could take part in it, right? So speak about him doing that. Speak about the range of things he covered, and also him pretty much spearheading. We see Malcolm X do it, and so many others after Malcolm X have used that same tradition on the soapbox.
Absolutely. Well, once again, I want to just read a quick passage from my book. This is also from the introduction. I said, in contrast to the Eurocentric mass media and education systems, Harrison's spellbinding street corner speaking, commitment to grassroots empowerment, fearless journalism, and encyclopedic knowledge allowed him to crystallize a new and revolutionary model, what some called the outdoor university, for free, urban, Black emancipatory education. It stood in stark contrast to both the industrial education symbolized by Booker T and Margaret Murray Washington's Tuskegee Institute and the quote unquote higher elite education of the colleges and universities in the liberal arts tradition of a Du Bois that were inaccessible to the masses of Black people. Perched atop a sidewalk stepladder at 135th Street and 7th Avenue and addressing audiences large enough to block traffic, Harrison spoke on subject matter ranging across such topics as African American art and popular culture, sociology, scientific racism, English literature, evolutionary biology, theological criticism, African history, macroeconomics, and global geopolitics. A. Philip Randolph aptly described this model of education as, quote, one of the great intellectual forums in America, unquote. Yeah, and you got the picture right there. I put a number of pictures into this book because I'm a teacher by training. I try to reach all the different.
I enjoy the illustrations, man. Out there on the block with the masses of people blocking traffic and everything like that, giving the lessons, man. And you did a good job too for the young people that younger than myself to make them realize back then, a lot of Black households, like, you didn't have a TV in every room.
Right.
You didn't have social media. You didn't have all these things. So it's like, we're going outside to the block and go and see what's going down. And not just him, but they had various other people, everybody doing their thing of different traditions, different organizations. And
Harrison, he helped to inaugurate a whole tradition, which other street corner speakers would take up, Black socialists, Black communists, Garveyites, Black preachers. There were a lot of different churches in Harlem. There were a lot of different fraternal orders in Harlem, different, associations of folks, political organizations. And so it's a dynamic community because it has migrants, not just Southern African Americans who are coming up to live in northern cities, but also Caribbean, Afro-Caribbeans are in Harlem. There's Africans from the continent that are in Harlem. Because of the de facto segregation of New York City, any Black migrant to the city was sent uptown. And it created this very dynamic, multi-ethnic, multi-national Black community that produced, extraordinary breakthroughs in terms of arts and culture, in terms of political theorizing and organization. And like the Garvey movement, which I imagine we might get to talk about a little bit, at least, because, Harrison as I argue in the book, Harrison plays a key role in the rise of Garvey and Garveyism.
Yeah, we go in there next for sure. And something just crossed my mind just now. Would you say he was a precursor to this podcast era? Like these podcasts now is our version of like this is my soapbox, if you will, right?
Right.
So like this is the podcast before they had the cell phones. They're on the block.
Right.
Getting it in.
Right.
This is the podcast, you know?
Right. I mean, humans, as humans, we are social creatures. And so if you go back to a time when we weren't on social media, we didn't have the internet, we didn't have television. I mean, even radio in the 1910s, the only types of black radio you might find were like minstrelsy, blackface type of programs, not actual black programming on the radio. And so that's why social life was lived outside in person, on the street corner, on the block. There's a whole strolling tradition in Harlem. People just going out to stroll, see who you see out, out on the block. You speak on street corners. And there's also this there's also this call and response dynamic, right? Which is very important from the African oral tradition of the griot, right? You have a kind of call and response where a street corner speaker could be heckled by the crowd, could be egged on by the crowd. There's a whole dynamic exchange, which I try to capture in chapter 3, because I think it's such a powerful sort of moment of oral culture, and particularly, I call it the grioversity because on the one hand, there's a university level of knowledge that people like Harrison and A. Philip Randolph and all these other folks had, because they were up to date on all the latest scholarship, that was coming out, whether it was sociology, anthropology, geopolitics, and what have you. But there's also a West African tradition of the griot, which is like this very kind of oral culture and oral sense making and space making and place making for the community, right? And so it's got this combination. It's kind of like this creolized combination of African tradition as well as European tradition, because of the both of those influences being present, in a context like Harlem. So I love that chapter because I feel like it really does the work of putting us into the set and setting of the texture of social life that we're talking about.
Yeah. So one of the main events for the book, for the average layperson at least, the whole connection to Marcus Garvey is the biggest part of the turning point, right? So give the audience an idea of like, what was the connection to Marcus Garvey to begin with, and then going to like his split from the UNIA toward the tail side of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, Garvey, a lot of people forget that Marcus Garvey, he was born in Jamaica. He becomes, sort of conscientized while he's in Jamaica. And his initial goal in 1914, when he, with Amy Ashwood, decided to establish the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League, or the UNIA for short, their initial program or idea is to build a Tuskegee-style institute in Jamaica. And so Garvey is writing letters to Booker T. Washington. He's appealing to Washington for support. He's extolling the fact that he's gotten all these white supporters and white donors, just like Washington had, right? Andrew Carnegie was, for example, a major donor to this Tuskegee Institute. Then Garvey comes to the U.S. He does this speaking tour, and he ends up in Harlem in 1917, and he's basically out of cash. He's about to go back to Jamaica. Meanwhile, Harrison is about to launch his Liberty League of Negro Americans. And so in June 12th, 1917, there's this massive meeting. 2,000 people packed the Bethel AME Church to hear a number of speakers who want to launch this organization and become a part of it. And Harrison gives Garvey a platform in that meeting. And by all accounts, Garvey, not only gave a great speech, but ends up joining Harrison's Liberty League. And one of the consequences of that is that Garvey totally transforms his vision for what the UNIA can accomplish, because the Liberty League is talking about a race-first doctrine. It's talking about an internationalist politic, supporting the struggles of colonized people all over the world. It's talking about building a mass movement, right, not just a brick and mortar school, but a mass movement. And it's got a tricolor flag, right? The Liberty League has a black, brown, and yellow flag, which, according to Harrison, is what sort of inspires the red, black, and green of the Garvey movement. So Garvey takes these elements and uses them to reimagine the UNIA and scale it up into what it becomes, which is the largest transnational organization of Black people in modern history. That would almost not have happened without, it would be difficult to imagine that happening without the decisive impact and influence of Hubert Harrison and the Liberty League. And so Garvey ends up getting so big, Garveyism, the UNIA the organization, gets so large with branches, in Africa and Europe and Latin America and the Caribbean. Garvey ends up tapping Hubert Harrison to edit the Negro World, the Garvey movement newspaper. And so Harrison, joins Garvey's ship, having influenced Garvey and taught him some key strategic ideas. He edits the Negro World. But in that context, Harrison is able to really see Garvey up close, in the Negro World offices, in Liberty Hall, in other settings, in the first UNIA International Convention in August of 1920. And Harrison's firsthand observations of Garvey left him really disappointed in a lot of Garvey's behavior, right? There's the authoritarianism. Garvey is basically sort of poo-pooing anybody who doesn't agree with him and stacking votes at the convention to kind of get his henchmen elected to certain positions of power. Harrison is critical of Garvey's talking about Africa as a country, right? Harrison understood that there were many ethnic groups and societies and civilizations in Africa. Like you don't want to just lump them all into one and declare yourself the president of all of that, which is what Garvey was doing. Garvey wanted a black empire over which the sun would never set. Harrison, by contrast, was an anti-imperialist, right? Harrison said capitalist imperialism is the enemy which we need to combine to fight. And so there's all these ways that Harrison is developing a sharp critique of Garvey from his firsthand observations, not to mention the lies that Garvey is telling, right? I mean, Garvey claims that there were 20,000 delegates at the first annual convention of the UNIA because there were thousands of people that had marched in the parade at the start of the convention. For Garvey to just declare all those people delegates, Harrison felt like was playing fast and loose with the truth, given that the actual number of delegates was closer to maybe 100 to 150 on any given day of the convention itself. So if you have 150 delegates in the convention, but in your newspaper you're putting out, oh, we had 20,000 delegates, it's like, who benefits from that, right? So these are some of the things that Harrison ultimately is critical of Garvey of, and ends up leaving the Garvey movement because he feels like Garvey is frankly crazy and egotistical and like kind of making an ass of himself and of the larger Garvey movement. And I try to be balanced in this conversation, because there's that on the one hand, but on the other hand, we can't deny the fact that Garveyism was extraordinarily influential and important on Black people all over the world, from Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana to Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya to Louise Little and Earl Little, the parents of Malcolm X, right? Garveyism, Rosa Parks' grandfather was a Garveyite, right? Shirley Chisholm was raised in a Garveyist household. Tarana Burke was raised in a Garveyist. I mean, the impact of Garveyism is difficult to overstate on an entire, not just one, but probably 2 or 3 generations of Black nationalists and African liberationists. And so I try to be balanced in that sense, right? Because it's a contradictory movement. On the one hand, Garveyism was much larger than Marcus Garvey and built an inspiring sort of global race pride among people everywhere from Trinidad to Nigeria. On the other hand, it's also, I think, a pretty good case study in the pitfalls of the HNIC model, right? Where you have one person at the top and anybody, it's like his way or the highway, right? I mean, one of the questions I often contemplate is, what if the Universal Negro Improvement Association could have retained the support of Hubert Harrison and Richard B. Moore, like all those Caribbean radicals, Richard B. Moore, Wilfred Domingo, Grace Campbell, right? Cyril Briggs. I mean, imagine if it could have grown larger and larger and larger. In other words, if it could have found a way not to have Marcus Garvey be the HNIC. I think it could have been an even more influential and even more powerful movement than it already was, right? Because when Garvey gets tried for mail fraud and then deported, it sends the movement into this crisis, and there's all these factions and splits, and I mean, basically that's the end of the heyday of Garveyism. Even though Garvey women, for example, and there's a great book by Natanya Duncan that I want to lift up called An Efficient Womanhood.
Yes, she will be on the show next month for the guests watching. I believe it's October the 10th. She will be on the show. That's an amazing book.
Yeah, I was just on a panel with her this morning alongside Gerald Horn and Sharice Burton-Stelly to talk about our two books and sort of the conversation that kind of exists on some level, but or not between them. But her book does a great job of rescuing dozens of women who built the Garvey movement. People like Henrietta Vinton Davis and Amy Ashwood Garvey, Amy Jakes Garvey, of course, Mamie Demina. Right. I mean, there's all these Ethel True Dunlap. That was a really interesting part of her book. You know, this white woman who's a part of the Garvey movement and one of the great poets in the pages of the Negro World newspaper. So I mean, there's an extraordinary story to tell about the benefits and the impact and the influence of Garveyism and the women and men who made it possible. But there's also, I think, a critique to be made of Garvey, which I also really don't pull punches about. I mean, one last example I'll share just before we maybe move on is Garvey openly saw Jewish Zionism in Palestine as a model for African redemption. Well, that didn't age too well, to say the least.
Not at all. Not at all. Another question from the chat. My brother asks, what contributed to his eloquent writing? Because he didn't have an elite education and wrote for a number of publications. I don't know if he mean Marcus Garvey or if he mean Harris. I'm thinking he means Harris. I think
he means Harrison. I'll assume that. Harrison did not have an elite education. He was self-taught. I mean, Harrison was born in the island of St. Croix, what is now part of the U.S. Virgin Islands. He had, I think, maybe a 9th grade education or so before he ends up basically, becoming self-taught. And so when he gets to Harlem as a teenager, he's reading books, and he had a genius level intellect, right? His mind could absorb information from all these different fields of study, and he loved to learn, and he was addicted to learning. And he was a bibliophile. So he would just read every single book he could get his hands on, no matter what the topic, no matter what the subject, no matter what the time period. And he could absorb it all. And so I think part of how he becomes a good writer is he knows a lot and he's read a lot. One of the things, if you want to become a better writer, reading is really critical, because the more good writers that you read, the more your writing will emulate what you're reading, right? And build on and learn from what you're reading. So I think that's the simple answer for how Harrison was so eloquent and sharp is that he read a lot, and he took influence and inspiration from all of the. I mean, one of the subjects that he used to lecture on was what we now think of as canonical English literature, right? So I'm talking about the people that Mark Twain, Rudyard Kipling, Edgar Allan Poe, H.G. Wells, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Arthur Conan Doyle, John Keats, Herman Melville, like all these kind of canonical English authors that we now think of as that. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, Charles Dickens, right? Like all that. Harrison used to lecture on all those cats. I mean,
that's crazy.
So he imbibed and absorbed the classics of some of the greatest literary figures that we know of.
So what you saying that, once again, we're going right to the next question off of that. This is a real turning point in the book for me too, about the Harlem Renaissance, because the Harlem Renaissance is one of my favorite time periods to study about, read about. I love being in there. And he had some sharp criticism toward the Harlem Renaissance time period and that movement. So tell us about some of his criticisms and like the pushback he got because of that. Him being written out of history and stuff like that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, Harrison once said something kind of funny and provocative, right? He said, "The matter of a Negro literary renaissance in Harlem is like the snakes of Ireland. There isn't any." And what he meant was not that there aren't interesting and important, literary figures and productions coming out of Harlem. What he meant was that the people, particularly white publishers, who were suddenly pushing this new Renaissance narrative, were ignorant of the rich tradition of Black literary production going back to the 1800s, right? And figures like William Wells Brown, Paul Laurence Dunbar, Pauline Hopkins, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, Charles Chestnut, and so on and so forth, right? There's a whole tradition of Black literary production prior to the 1920s, and Harrison dared them. He said, "I dare you to pick any decade from 1850 all the way up to 1920 where I can't show you either more or better Black literary production, books and novels and plays and so on, than anything that's happening right now in the 20s." And so he exposed the fact that this new Renaissance narrative was essentially a marketing tactic in order to sell the Negro to white audiences, right? And to sell a particular version of Black arts and culture, the non-threatening, the patriotic, the politically moderate Black literary production and artistic production, right? So you have somebody like, for example, Claude McKay, who is actually a radical poet, a Black Marxist from Jamaica, right? But when Alain Locke puts a poem of Claude McKay's in his New Negro anthology, which becomes kind of like the foundation stone of this new Renaissance fad, he deliberately changed the title of McKay's poem from The White House to White Houses. In other words, he changes the whole meaning of the poem from a pointed attack on the poisonous hatred coming out of the White House, much like we're seeing today, into something that's just about white houses, right? And sort of almost like shifting the blame from the White House onto white suburbia or something like that. I mean, just totally changes the meaning of the poem. And McKay was livid about that. He's like, what are you doing? Like, you didn't even ask me to change the title, and now you've reprinted it, not just in the magazine edition. Now you've reprinted the same wrong title in the book. Like, it just showed that there was this deliberate agenda at work to eliminate the old protest psychology, as Paul Kellogg, one of the white liberal publishers, put it. Basically, the idea is that the white liberal publishers wanted art and not anger. They didn't want Black folks, protesting and voicing their discontent about lynching and segregation and disfranchisement and all this stuff. They wanted them to produce art, and they thought that if they just produced some nice and palatable art, that would solve the race problem by itself. And so Harrison gets written out of history in part because he has this devastating critique of the so-called Harlem Renaissance narrative, which in turn excludes him, right? And doesn't want to remember him, doesn't want to remember the contributions that Harrison made to the intellectual and artistic and cultural dynamism of Harlem, including as a street corner speaker, including as an indoor lecturer at the 135th Street branch, what is now the Schomburg Center. Harrison helped Schomburg move his books from Brooklyn, his huge archival collection in Brooklyn, all the way up to Harlem, 135th Street branch of the public library, where it became what is now the Schomburg Center. And kudos to the 100th year anniversary that they're celebrating this year. It's the centenary of the Schomburg Center. But yeah, I mean, that's part of why Harrison has been so erased and marginalized, is that the so-called Harlem Renaissance narrative, didn't want to lift up not just Harrison, but they didn't want to remember other Black socialists, Black communists. They didn't want to remember Garvey, all the Garveyist artistic and literary production. They didn't want to remember the blues women who are, sexually liberated and so on. There's a whole wing of more radical, forward-thinking folks who are deliberately excluded from the narrative, the Renaissance narrative.
The whole thing with Alain Locke changing the title of the poem and that back and forth.
Yeah.
The more I read history, it tripped me out the intellectual beef they had back in the day, because So many times we see certain things on social media now, we always thinking like, man, they on social media going back and forth with these posts and videos and tweets, but like we see so many intellectuals back then, they were definitely egotistical, they were cocky,
Yeah,
Dr. Carter G. Woodson and so getting into it,
yeah,
and
yeah,
it was just
yeah,
all these guys round and round all the time because they always thought they were the H and I C, like you said, they thought they was the man, and I went to this certain school, I got these certain degrees, and
yeah.
it was always crazy, man.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you reminded me of of the subsection in chapter 7 when I'm talking about Harrison's influence on Garvey and Garveyism, where Harrison has to defend the race first doctrine against the black socialists like A. Philip Randolph and Wilfred Domingo and Chandler Owen, who are pushing the class first doctrine as socialists, right? And some of that debate became very acrimonious and personalistic and and unsavory, right? Because of how ego gets involved, because of how personalities can clash, and frankly, because this is a question that has vexed Black radicals down to the present day. Do we put race first or class first? Especially in a context where those who are pushing or claiming to push the class first politic are themselves a majority white socialist or communist organization that only really has token black folks, at the table, and is not actually staunchly fighting for black liberation in the ways that we would like to see those who claim to be class first. Well, here's a population that is more working class than any other, right? Black communities are the most thoroughly working class communities in the country, as Harrison was trying to argue to the Socialist Party to try to get them to see. If you claim to stand for the emancipation of the working class, and yet the most working class part of the population that's experiencing lynching and disfranchisement and racial segregation and anti-black massacres and pogroms, you got nothing to say about that, so there's an interesting political dance that I try to unpack, or at least uncover a bit, about
Yeah,
how that debate even got started of race first versus class first.
yeah, yeah. I got two more questions for you before we get out of here. Two more questions.
Go.
One, so Harrison's death carried a lot of question marks, even amongst his family. So, what do you make of the fact that a lot of our biggest, brightest heroes, there's always so many question marks around their death, man? Like, there's so many guys you could think of, like the way they died or the circumstances always like, and why do you think that is? The question.
Well, I mean, this is a place where I was able to apply some of the knowledge and understanding that I have about other cases of suspicious circumstances, let's just say, to Harrison. So the assassination of Dr. King, for example, right? I would encourage people to look at the work of William Pepper, who's written a trilogy of books. He spent, over 4 decades by now on this case, and exposed the fact that, that Dr. King was killed by the government, because he had become a revolutionary and a radical. Fred Hampton is an even more clear-cut case because the FBI just ran up and shot him in the night in his sleep. But once you look at Malcolm X, I mean, clearly the government was involved there too. They want to blame the nation, but Malcolm understood he was being followed when he was abroad, in Africa and in the Middle East. He, like, the people who are following me here, these are not Nation of Islam people. These are CIA, because he understood the nation didn't have the capacity to send intelligence agents into the Middle East and Africa to follow him, right? Like, he knew the capacity of the organization. So once you realize that there is what we might call a deep state that has committed some of these assassinations of a Malcolm X or a Dr. King, then when you go back into history, into Harrison, it allows you to ask different questions about the circumstances of his death. And especially when you have the family being skeptical, right? Harrison, the story, just briefly, is that Harrison, he had appendicitis, so he needed to go in for an operation to get his appendix removed, which is not a particularly risky operation, right? It's pretty standard procedure. And he even told his daughter, "Oh yeah, I'm just going to the hospital for a short stay. I'll be back." And he goes in on a Thursday. Gets there on a Tuesday. He checks in. He has the surgery on Thursday, and apparently there's no complications. It goes well. On Friday, he's feeling so good. He's even entertaining visitors. They're coming to visit him. They're greeting him. Procedure's done. And then suddenly, Friday night, things took a turn for the worse. And by Saturday morning, he ends up dead. And so this is a place, and strangely enough, the surgeon who conducted the operation himself, a guy called Maurice Marlowe, he ended up committing suicide by a morphine overdose some years later. So the question I raise is, was there foul play, right? For example, was Harrison injected with a morphine overdose to make it look like he died from a complication that arose during or after the surgery? I don't have any smoking gun evidence about this, but I do think that the circumstances are very suspicious. And of course, we know that Harrison had a lot of enemies because he was so fearlessly critical of, any number of different prominent institutions and individuals. It makes sense to ask the question, like, was there foul play in his death? And not to mention, by the way, I have to put all of this, the assassinations of these figures, in a larger context of lynching. I mean, there was an epidemic. Lynching was a national epidemic. We're talking about thousands of people, especially Black men, though not exclusively Black men, but thousands of lynchings. And so one of the interesting questions I've asked my students is, what's the relationship between the assassination of a Fred Hampton or a Dr. King or a Malcolm X or a Patrice Lumumba and an Amilcar Cabral and lynching, right? To what extent were lynchings actually a small-scale assassinations of those uppity Negroes who were trying to start a business and were creating competition with the white business, right? I think that's a really interesting question as well, because it means that perhaps this assassination dynamic that we think of as just a few isolated incidents is actually a much larger phenomenon. It's just that the local leaders, the local Dr. Kings and Fred Hamptons, whose names we might never know, but
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
Yeah.
That's right. So one of my newest questions I have for my scholars, I'm a process-driven guy. I want to know, how do you go about the process of reading? Some folks have different methodologies and different tools and tricks or whatever it might be. I want to know, how do you go about reading, Doctor?
That's a great question. One of the things I learned in grad school, I had this great advice from my supervisor, Stephen Tuck, who he said, you got to read for argument. Okay. And part of this is germane, I think, to the discipline of history and sort of how historians think about books, which is basically that, like, most sort of traditional history books are making some argument, right? And you can usually figure out what that argument is pretty quickly, which allowed me to learn how to read much faster, because I wasn't reading for every detail or for every crossed T and dotted I. I was reading for argument, which meant I could read a book in about 10 minutes, because you don't need to know every little detail if you're just looking for the argument. So, for example, one of the things I would do with every subfield, first of all, I had to read multiple different subfields in order to try to reconstruct the context for Harrison's life and world. And this was another thing that my supervisor really helped me to emphasize. So I read all that I could, for example, about the Socialist Party in the early 20th century. And one of the first things I would do, I would go to the index and see, do they mention Hubert Harrison? And 99 times out of 100, it was no. In fact, I would even look for A. Philip Randolph, and they usually wouldn't even mention him, I would look for Negro to see if there was any discussion of Negro politics, the Negro question, the Negro problem, as it was originally called. And so it allowed me to read, to wrap my head around what I needed to know about that historiography very quickly, right? I mean, I could literally in 2 minutes see if a book was going to mention Harrison or not. And if not, which was usually the case, then I understood, okay, I can make a contribution here even more easily, because no one's been talking about Harrison. No one has written him back into, or very few people, let me say, have written him back into this history of the Socialist Party and of the sort of left or Marxist movement more generally. Same with the Garvey movement historiography. I read dozens of books about Garvey and Garveyism. One of the first things I would do, go to the index. Do they mention Harrison? No? Okay, good. That means I have a story to tell here, right? I can fill a gap in the historiography. And so on and so forth with the Harlem Renaissance, literature. There's a whole body of literature about that. I would look for any mention of him there. I would look for any mention of him in what little I could find about Black freethinkers. There's a book by Chris Cameron, which is great, but doesn't have a lot about Harrison as a Black freethinker, even though it has a lot about other Black freethinkers. And so that was one of the methods I used, was try to see, like, is this person being mentioned? If he's not, then what does that mean for how I'm going to put him back in the story, right? And it ended up being nice because, like, it almost got to the point where I could guess without even going to the index. I could just, like, based on when the book was written, based on sort of what the topic of the book was, I could almost guess whether or not they had said anything about Harrison. And so it became like kind of a fun little game, but also a way for me to see where and when I could get in this story, right, and fit it in a way that would complement or augment or embellish, the scholarship that's already there.
And what about when you're reading for pleasure? Like, what's the contrast in that? You just like, I'm just chilling, kicking it. I'm just reading just to chill out. Like, what's that like?
I didn't do much of that in graduate school because you're on the clock. You got you got a limited amount of time to get through what you need to do, and so you gotta, especially with a topic like Harrison, right? And that's one of the things that's one of the reasons why this book took me over a decade to produce, is that most books are dealing with like one framework, right? They're dealing with Black Marxism, or they're dealing with Black nationalism, or they're dealing with the Harlem Renaissance, right? They're dealing with one framework. Harrison is like a multi-dimensional figure. So in order to paint the picture of Harrison's world and context, I had to master multiple historiographies, right? And so that just took a lot more time, and it made it even less likely that I would have extra time for just reading for pleasure, right? Like that that wasn't even a thing, frankly.
Okay, so you said since like 2013, I think you said you started the whole process. Now,
Yep.
The baby is born. You give him birth, right? You're doing these shows. You're traveling.
Yep. My 12-year-old is now out in the world.
yeah, right. It's a big exhale. So the question is, and what do you forecast like next? Like you've done this big old undertaking. Anything on the horizon? Anything bubbling? Or your brain pretty much like, look, I just gotta breathe for a while. I gotta recalibrate.
No. I'm in a place now where I'm jazzed to get this book out, right? I'm doing a book tour. I've been to Chicago. I've been to the DMV. I'm now in Atlanta. I'm gonna be going to Ohio next month. I'll be in St. Louis as well next month. I mean, and I need to get to some other places like New York, for example, which I haven't gotten to yet. I do also hope to get to
come on down to Louisiana, man. Come on down to the dirty, man.
Yes. Let's do it.
Come down the ball.
Let's do it. Some people, they finish their book and they're just so sick of working on that subject, they're ready to move on to the next thing. That is not the case for me. I'm keen to get this book, like to really, I had a senior scholar by the name of Tiffany Willoughby Herrod. She's in political science at UC Irvine, older Black woman, has written a lot, published a lot. She was like, you know what? You need to be touring with this book for the next 5 years so that Harrison can become a household name. And I was like, wow, like I hadn't thought of it. I hadn't thought of it that way. I thought maybe 1 or 2 years, maybe 3 more years, and then I'll move on. I'm like, she's like, no, just lean into this, especially because I've invested, over a decade on it already.
Real.
So now it's time to reap the fruits of like all the work that I put into it. And that's why I tell people like you're not just buying a book, whatever price you're finding on UNC, and I have them at a discounted rate if you get them from me, but you're not just buying a book, you're buying a piece of my heart and soul, because I poured myself into this work, and I believe it I believe it's worth it. It's like however you can get it, like you will learn something new from this book.
We need the movie. We need a documentary.
Yes.
We need a series.
Yes. We need a graphic novel. We need a children's book.
Novel. Yeah. The young adult version.
Yeah.
In particular, I noticed for the past few years, I'm excited about it as an adult. I love how many books are being put into a young adult adaptation. I go and buy all those books, man. Like I love having both of those versions.
Yes.
I love it, man. But yeah,
Yes.
that's a real thing.
Yeah, man. Well, let me know if you have any particular, like an example of someone who's made that conversion well, like an adult
I would
version
say,
and a.
I would say here in New Orleans, the author Clinton Smith, The How the
Mhm,
Word Is Passed, an amazing book. But
mhm.
the young adult version coming out like next week, matter of fact, like Tuesday.
Okay.
The young adult adaptation of that book is coming out. I'm going to buy it ASAP because I love that book.
Mm.
I love the things he broke down in it. So to witness somebody take that kind of history and distill it to where my daughter could get it, I think that's amazing and phenomenal. Bro. You know what I'm saying?
Definitely.
That's
Yeah,
amazing.
I would love to do that. I would love to work on some, some
Yeah,
spin-offs that can make it
yeah,
even more accessible.
yeah, yeah. Okay, I don't want to keep your time. You out there doing your thing for the weekend, man. But the last question on the live was, who are your top 5 black radicals? Top 5,
Mm,
dead or alive?
mm, mm. Wow, that's a good question, but it's a tough one because there's so many, so many to choose from. But yeah, I mean, Harrison obviously is one of them. I think Walter Rodney is another really critical, black radical. Ella Baker, I got to give a shout out to Ella Baker, especially because I lean on her definition of what it means to be radical. um, Gosh, I don't know. Asada is very inspiring, from another generation, another era. Um, I mean, the Panthers. I mentioned Fred Hampton already. Might as well throw Fred Hampton in the mix. I mean, there's just so many though. It's just like I don't know if I can choose just 5, but there's 5 to start with. Cabral is another one. If I had a bonus, number 6, Milcar Cabral.
And last night reading this book, it made me cross-reference, thanks to my brother right here in the chat, William Monroe Trotter already had his book, The Black Radicals. And it
Yep.
made me go back to look at their connection together with the Liberty League and
Yep.
everything. I
Yep.
got to go and finish that book, but his
Yep.
name not said enough as well in this day.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Trotter's really underappreciated, I think, and I'm glad that Kerry Greenidge's book is out because it's sort of like another moment and reason to celebrate and uplift one of the sort of more underappreciated figures like a William Monroe Trotter. So, absolutely.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Thank you for the live chat. Thanks for y'all questions. Anybody watching this later in YouTube land, drop a comment. I love answering back. Share, like, subscribe. Next week, I'm gonna have Dr. Ian Smith coming on this brand new fictional book, Beyond Midnight. So check in for the flyer on that next week. And see y'all next time on the Sean P Experience, man.
Thanks so much, brother.
Hold on 1 second, Doc. Hold on 1 second. I am off the live.